If you enjoy my videos, don't forget to like them, share them, and subscribe to my channel. And remember, small YouTube channels like this can't be monetized, so if you're able to support me by becoming a patron, it really helps. My Patreon link is in the description.
We're very fortunate to have Chris Hughes with us today. She is a writer, a ritualist, a hedge teacher, and a storyteller. She's a devotee of the three Celtic horse goddesses, Epona, Rhiannon, and Macha. Her writing and teaching focuses on Celtic mythology, British Isles folklore, and folk customs, and Celtic paganism. She is a prolific blogger and essayist. She also writes poetry and occasional short fiction. Originally from rural Colorado, Chris spent much of her adult life in Edinburgh, Scotland, where she worked as a professional musician. She returned to Colorado in 2009 and tried ranching, but it was too hot. So she now lives in Northwest Oregon, where she can get drenched, where she hopefully. So welcome, Chris, and thank you for being up at this hour.
So welcome, everybody. When Ellen asked me to do this talk, she initially asked me to talk about Brythonic Reconstructionism, but the bad news is I'm not a Reconstructionist, and I'm not exclusively Brythonic either. So I started out about 40 years ago trying to figure out how to connect with what I thought of as the old gods. And I just moved to Edinburgh in Scotland at that time. And quite a lot of that connection for me actually came through the land. Certain deities just seemed to be really immanent in the landscape. And we're talking 40 years ago, so there wasn't the amount of information available then that there is today, of course. So over the years, I started reading a lot of mythology, mostly Irish. And I had friends who were storytellers, and I went out with an archaeologist for a couple of years. Here's my life story. And I knew people who were involved with the School of Scottish Studies at Edinburgh University, mostly people who are working in folklore. So I was really busy with life, and I never really knew a lot of other pagans or joined any groups. I just figured things out as I went along. So it was only about 10 years ago when I moved back to the US that I started connecting with other pagans and had a complete change of lifestyle. And I was homesick for the UK, and Facebook was starting to get popular. It was kind of a perfect storm. So that's when I discovered that other people who called themselves Celtic pagans weren't doing what I was doing. And one thing that they found odd was that I had relationships with deities that they considered Irish and Gaulish and Brythonic. Now, I'd been taking a pretty scholarly approach to things for a long time. I did understand the distinction, and I didn't think that, like all Celtic culture, was some monolithic thing across different languages and regions. However, I lived in southern Scotland, and I knew that all these deities were immanent in the landscape because at various times, by various groups of people whose cultures kind of layered themselves onto my homeland, they'd all been honored there, and their stories had been told there. So I think this talk needs to start with a quick potted history of early Britain, which will help you understand why Brythonic myths and deities look different from Irish ones. So the whole of the island of Britain was Brythonic speaking at one time. Linguists can't agree on whether the islands of Britain and Ireland once spoke a mutually intelligible Celtic language, some kind of common insular Celtic or not. We don't really need to worry about that today. But from Pictland up in the north of Scotland, Shetland and Aberdeenshire and all of that, right down to the south of England, everybody was speaking some form of Brythonic language. In other words, a language related to modern Welsh. So there was probably a continuum of related dialects and cultures from one end of Britain to the other. And likely that would include some myths and some deities in common, as well as, of course, local deities, river goddesses, things like that. So as you probably know, the Romans invaded and brutally colonized Britain starting in the 1st century. So just as they did in Gaul, they adopted or appropriated local gods as well as introducing their own. But they brutally tried to overthrow the Druid priesthood because they saw them as seditious. So you were allowed to worship your gods, but you had to do it in the Roman fashion. So this is an oversimplification, obviously, but it'll do for today. So depending on who was emperor at the time, some of the Romans were also Christians. And so Christianity was introduced to Britain very early in small doses at first. So I'm not saying the whole country was converted. Somewhat earlier than in Ireland, though. So some Britons became at least nominally Christian. And then by the 4th century, the Romans were leaving a big hole in Britain. The Angles and Saxons and Scots were already arriving. So the Britons themselves never got a lot of breathing space between one set of invaders and the other. And of course, as I say, the Gaelic-speaking Scots were starting to arrive from Ireland about the same time. I think it's really hard for us to imagine what that looked like for the indigenous Britons. You know, this is just like some kind of history to us. And this isn't a perfect analogy, but try and picture this. It would be a bit like, imagine if all the Africans and Asians and Europeans suddenly left North America. The indigenous population might breathe a sigh of relief, but in the short term, they'd be deprived of all kinds of infrastructure and trade, and there would be unrest. But then as the colonists leave, let's say the Chinese invade and they start settling the land. And their overwhelming numbers would make resistance futile, even if they did it peacefully. There's just so many of them. So that's a bit like what the indigenous Britons experienced. Meanwhile, in Ireland, nothing much happened. I don't mean that nothing happened for the Irish people, but there was no huge upheaval. They weren't invaded. The Roman conquest and the Saxon conquest really didn't have an important effect in Ireland. The next big news was that Christianity began to catch on in a big way on both islands. The Irish were able to deal with that change without as much overt threat to their language or culture. Yes, it was a religious change, which is very important from our point of view, but it seems like quite a lot of that was peaceful. Quite a lot of that was whatever, welcomed. We don't know really. In the 6th and 7th century, we even have hints that the Irish were beginning to create manuscripts in their own language, while the indigenous Britons were just kind of licking their wounds, dealing with colonization by the Saxons, retreating westward. So the next problem, of course, was the Vikings and the other Norse, and that was shared by Britain and Ireland, of course, and that brought in some cultural change for both islands. And then things settled down again. And the next big news didn't come until the 11th century with the Norman conquest. And this was kind of like the Romans all over again for Britain, except that at least everyone was Christian this time. So there was no big change to the religion, just bigger churches. And then a century later, of course, Ireland's relative isolation was finally shattered when the Anglo-Normans invaded Ireland. They started, making life hell for the Irish, and we're still dealing with the legacy of that, even today, of course. The reason I prolonged this history lesson was really to try to give you some sense of why things look so different as far as what we know of the indigenous mythology of Britain versus Ireland. Why our tradition of mythological texts start later in the medieval period, why they look more like literature than mythology when they're compared to the Irish texts. So the Irish had over 1,000 years of relatively undisturbed cultural development and consolidation that the Britons didn't get. So just like in Ireland, it's hard to know much about actual indigenous pre-Christian practices in Britain. What we do have that Ireland lacks are, of course, the Romano-British inscriptions, few statues, and the account of the slaughter of the Druids on Anglesey. However, it's still difficult to know whether certain deities were worshipped in Britain before the Romans came, or whether the Romans actually brought some continental Celtic deities with them. And one thing that fascinates me are the cognate deities like Lugh and Lleu. It was an obvious one, but what about Gobanos, Govanen, Govnu, or the controversial Brigando, Brigantia, Bridget? So I'm not an expert on Romano-Celtic British religion or Romano-British religion or Romano-Celtic religion, but Epona's been my patron goddess for many years. And I also have a close relationship with Maponos, whom I pretty much see that as him as one deity. I don't experience a difference in who that is. It's just local names for the same deity, I think. Since I've returned to the US, I find I don't have much of a relationship with the land. And the reasons for that are personal, and honestly, I've stopped worrying about it. However, my interest in medieval texts, what we think of as Celtic mythology and bardic poetry, has become super important. So when I lived in Britain, a lot of my relationship with deity seemed to come through the landscape, as I said. Now, it often comes from studying texts. So that's a big part of my devotional work now, is studying those texts and then trying to share with people, you know, what I find. And I do sometimes kind of feel like I'm guided to, you know, let's read this, here's some understanding for that. So I've ended up focusing somewhat more on the Brythonic than the Irish texts over the last few years, but I'm very interested in both, and especially interested in comparing them. So I'm guessing that most of you know a fair bit about the Irish texts, and not so much about those in the Welsh language. You've no doubt heard of the Mabinogi, which I'm going to talk about a bit, because it's probably the core text that we have. But we have a lot of bardic material which supports and enriches that once you know where to look. So the 4 branches of the Mabinogi sit at the center of the mythology or literature, if you prefer. And in the form we have them, the texts might date to the 12th or 13th century. The surviving manuscripts date to the 14th century. Now, that's a bit later than a lot of Irish texts and manuscripts. But just like the Irish material, you can date the manuscript, and you can probably date the language in the manuscript if you're a linguist, but it's a lot trickier to date the stories that are being told. So one obvious difference is that the Irish texts have some characters that are openly referred to as gods from time to time. And you never find that in the Welsh texts. There are a few reasons why that's the case. So Christianity was adopted a bit earlier in Britain. British culture was then weakened by Roman and Saxon influence, and the texts themselves are later. So this affects all the stories and the bardic poetry, not just the Mabinogi. So the 4 branches are the centerpiece of mythological texts in Welsh. And these are the stories of Rhiannon and Bran the Blessed and Lleu and Gwydion, Rhanrod, Blodeudd. Some of these names will probably be familiar to you. And while the characters aren't called deities, stories are still full of names that are cognate with Gaulish and Irish deities. There are stories which are closely related to the Irish ones that we have, sometimes overtly, and other times by strange little details that you don't discover for years. You know, you have to keep studying to find these little gems. And you go, oh, I recognize you. Or some wonderful scholar points it out. So there are another 7 stories, which are usually included in what people call the Mabinogion. 3 of these are Arthurian romances, which seem to contain a fair bit of indigenous material mixed in with the continental stuff, and 4 so-called native tales, which have kind of elements of both myth and legend. That is, real people from history are kind of intermixed with deities. Now, you have a certain amount of that in Irish folklore and in the cycle of the kings, but we have a lot more of that in Brythonic lore. So the study of early history always becomes important when you start getting really into Brythonic lore. So just briefly, as I've said, bardic poetry is important, especially the tome known as the Book of Taliesin. And these poems are quite mystical and intentionally obscure, but they're worth the effort. And often there's gems in them that illuminate both the stories from the Mabinogi and later bits of folklore. And we also have a wonderful thing called the Triads of Britain. And these are quite different than the Irish triads. The Irish triads are more like wisdom sayings or little proverbs. The Triads of Britain were memory aids for the bards, and these group similar events from different stories as a way for the bards to kind of connect things up and keep them straight, I suppose. So you get things like the 3 exalted prisoners of the island of Britain, for example, and those are Mabinogi and Lleu and Gwyr. And if you know your stuff, because you're a bard or because you're a student, then you know that Mabinogi was imprisoned in Gloucester Castle in the story of Culhwch and Olwen, and that Lleu was imprisoned by the guy who stole his wife, and Gwyr is mentioned as a prisoner in the other world in the Book of Taliesin. So these texts and other work together to support study of the mythological texts, a bit the same way that you would use the Dinhenachus or the early Irish glossaries when you're studying Irish myth. So let's talk a bit more about the Mabinogi. The name arose because at the end of each of the stories, known as the 4 branches, there's a little tagline at the end of each story in the manuscripts, and it says, "Here ends this branch of the Mabinogi." And Mabinogion is the result of a scribal error at the end of one branch in one manuscript. But the first guy who translated these things into English, Owen Pugh, in the 18th century, he decided that he would perpetuate this Mabinogion because it sounded better or something. And so it stuck. Now, the word Mabinogi itself is difficult to satisfactorily translate, but it's generally agreed that the root is mab or map or mabon, which means a son or a young man. It's cognates mac in Goidelic languages. So there are 3 possibilities why we have this root to do with son or a young man in the Mabinogi. So first, it could be stories about the god Mabon. That might seem strange since he doesn't appear at all in the 4 branches. But many scholars think that perhaps the character Pryderi, who is Rhiannon's son, Now, Pryderi is the only character who appears in all four branches. There's good reason to think he might be Mabon by another name. So that might make sense because by the time these texts appeared, both Mabon and his mother Modron had been reinvented as Christian saints. And so their names would sit awkwardly in stories which obviously had pagan elements. So the second possibility is that they're simply stories about young men. Every branch has young, heroic male character in it. And the third idea is that these were stories used by the bards to educate the young men of the nobility. So stories for the young men. Now that makes a lot of sense because the young men in these stories constantly come up against various problems to do with honor and good leadership, how to treat women. And I can see how these would have made really good talking points for the young men to discuss what the right course of action would be in various situations. They aren't morality tales in the sense of, and the moral of the story is, and if you just do this, it will all be perfect. They're much more, you have to think. In my classes on the Mabinogi, we have the most wonderful discussions about who was the person who was in the right in this story. So that doesn't mean, though, I think that these stories were devised for the purpose of teaching young men. They obviously contain a lot of older mythological layers dealing with things like sovereignty and magic, transformation, the other world, all of that. So this list of 3 reasons for the name is interesting, but I think in some ways they're all 3 probably true. So as I said, the 4 branches are kind of the jewel in the crown of Welsh myth. We also have a whole lot more stories in the Mabinogion. So if we look at the 4 branches first, this shows what the traditional names are in English for each of the 4 branches. They're each named after one of the central characters. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but just enough that a lot of people have heard these stories or caught bits of these stories. And I think some of you at least will recognize some of this, what I'm talking about. And you go, oh, so that's in the 4 branches, I hope. So the first branch, Culhwch, is the one where Rhiannon rides in on her white horse. Culhwch is drawn into the other world by an otherworldly king and has to fight a battle on his behalf and all of that. In Branwen, the giant King Bran leads an attack on Ireland, and his people end up bringing his enormous head back to Britain after he's killed and burying it under the Tower of London to protect Britain from attack from the continent. In the third branch, Manawydan, son of Llŷr, this is about Rhiannon again and her son Pryderi. And this is the one where their kingdom disappears in a mist and they get imprisoned in a magical fortress. Big adventure. And Math, son of Mathonwy, is about the conception of Lleu and his mother Arianrod and Blodeuwedd, the woman made from flowers. So in addition to the 4 branches, there's another 7 stories, which are generally grouped in with them and are grouped in with them in the manuscripts in which they occur. There are 4 we call the native tales, and these are less well known. They're each quite unique. There's no relationship between one story and another. Culhwch and Olwen concerns Mabon ap Modron, among other things, and actually has a lot of Irish references in it, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Lugh and Lleu, they're 2 kings, they're brothers, and this will maybe be of interest to you. So Lugh is cognate with Nuada and also Nodens, the Romano-British god Nodens, and Neith, the father of Gwyn ap Neith. So that's all one sort of complex of names which appear to be cognate. So you could think of Llydd as being a bit like Nuada, and Llefelys is a form of Lugos Lleu Lle. So this is not the story of Nuada and Lleu. I'm not suggesting that, but it's very interesting to look at the relationship between these two kings and think about what you see in the story that's reminiscent of the relationship between Nuada and Lleu. You might have to think about it a bit hard, but it's there. Trust me. The dream of Maxwn Wledig is about a Roman emperor and a British princess called Ellen. And this story contributes to the modern understanding of the recently evolving sort of goddess Ellen of the Ways, whether you believe in her or not. Part of what people are doing is connecting this story to her lore. And then finally, we have the dream of Rhonabwy, which is quite mystical and allegorical and kind of hard to parse. This is the dream of a man. He has this dream when he decides to sleep on the yellow skin of an ox, which of course recalls slightly the Tarfesh in Irish lore. And finally, then we have the three romances. So these are stories of King Arthur. Arthur was represented a bit differently in the very early Welsh material. Then, of course, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about Arthur, and he wove in a lot of historical and legendary Welsh heroes of the Old North. And they kind of sit, I feel, very uncomfortably along the fictional, beside the fictional characters that Geoffrey and the continental writers added to the mix. So these three tales contain a lot of native material and ideas, but they're rewritten. They're based loosely on Chrétien de Troyes and others. So the material leaves Britain, it goes to the continent, it comes back again. The Welsh say, we can do our own version of this. And some of the older remembered stuff gets woven into the story. So the layers here of history and myth and legend and fiction are quite densely packed, which makes them both interesting and kind of infuriating to study. So if you're interested in reading the Mabinogi, I suggest you start with the 4 branches. They're the easiest, they're the most rewarding, and you need a good translation. And for that, I suggest you avoid Lady Charlotte Guest. Like many translators of her day, I'm thinking of Lady Gregory, for example. She was a bit squeamish about sex and other things. Plus, modern translations are just naturally better because scholarship in Middle Welsh has come on in leaps and bounds since her day. So the translations I particularly recommend would be Patrick Ford or Shauna Davies or Will Parker. Now, the first two, Ford and Davies, you can easily get a paperback for not too much money. And Will Parker is actually available online, and he's got super, super copious notes with the stories. So it's very useful to help you understand it and see all kinds of weird connections to other Celtic stuff, to history, and so on. In the document that I put in the chat, there's a link to an article where I go into great detail about all the different translations of the Mabinogi. These aren't all, but these are good modern translations. So would be probably the place to start. There are a couple of other good ones too, but they're more expensive. They're not as easy to get, and so on. So I constantly meet people who tell me that, they've read the Mabinogi, when what they've actually read is Evangeline Walton's books. So this isn't the Mabinogi, it's fantasy fiction based on the Mabinogi, and it will really confuse you about the Mabinogi. So, if you love fantasy fiction, that's fine, but it isn't that. So if you decide to read the 4 branches, I've got a few suggestions for things you might want to watch for. The 4 stories do form a kind of loose narrative from branch 1 through to branch 4. there's also a lot to be gained from comparing each branch like vertically. So for example, every branch has a wedding in it, and it's worth comparing those weddings to one another. How do people behave? How are the brides treated, and so on? Each of the 4 branches contains a mother and son pairing, and there are some parallels and some interesting differences in their relationships in the different branches. And as in many Irish stories, the importance of being scrupulously careful with what you promise to do is emphasized in each of the 4 branches. So you can see people either being very honorable about that or running into trouble because they were careless about it. So it's really worth noticing that these things aren't static. It's not the same in each branch. I don't want to give the game away too much, but all these themes I mentioned undergo change as you go through the branches. And this makes it worth comparing the stories vertically, not just thinking of them as some kind of a saga with episodes, because they really aren't that. And you'll be a bit disappointed if you're expecting that. There is a slight connection between each of the stories, but it's almost a construction in some cases just to connect them. They aren't really very, very connected. Or at least that's what you think, until once in a while you run up against something and you go, oh. So I hope your ears pricked up a bit when I mentioned that I'm interested in cognates and connections between Irish and Welsh mythology. So just to start with a bit of low-hanging fruit, you're probably familiar with the Irish folklore concerning the conception of and the early life of Lleu. So the stuff about Balor's Tower on Tory Island and so on. This doesn't make it into the mythological cycle texts. It's been, many, many different versions of this story were collected by sort of 19th and early 20th century folklorists. So there are many, many parallel points between that folklore, between these stories of the conception of Lleu and the story of Lleu in the 4th branch. So this will mean something if you're familiar with the story. If you're not, you can go off and find it, or there's some stuff in that document about Lleu and Lleu. So both their mothers live in a tower by the sea. Both conceptions seem to be achieved through magic and trickery and with intention. Somebody is trying to bring about the birth of this god. Other children born at the same time swim away in the sea as infants. Someone has to be tricked into giving the child a name. Both of them are destined to kill somebody with a spear. Now I know in the second battle of Moytura, Lleu kills Balor with a talav, with a stone or a piece of clay that he throws from a sling. But in the folk version, he throws a spear at Balor and puts it through his eye. And both of them ultimately end up in a fatal fight over an unfaithful wife. So we know this from the Dinhenachus about Lleu. So there's more, but you get the idea that there's actually a lot of connection there. And of course, if you only know about Lleu from the medieval texts, you won't see that similarity between the 2 deities, but it's definitely there. And I think when you see that, then you begin to see, this is how it works for me anyway, that my sense of who Lleu is or who Lleu is enriched by knowing the story of the cognate deity. It has a deeper meaning. This isn't a perfect analogy because I'm not suggesting that one set of mythology is necessarily older than the other. But did you ever have that experience of you knew someone for a while, maybe quite a long time, especially an older person, and then they tell you about their early life or something like that, and you have a whole different dimension to understanding that person? And I think that's what I get from looking at comparing Irish myth and Welsh myth to some extent. So another one of interest is in the story of Culhwch and Olwen. Now that might be the oldest text in the Mabinogi. So briefly, the hero Culhwch has to complete a long list of tasks in order to win Olwen, the woman he loves. And part of this involves hunting a magical boar. Now the name of the boar is the Culhwch Truth. You'll see that written in a minute. I'm going to share the screen. If that name seems familiar, it might be because this beast is mentioned in a very different context in the Book of Invasions. So here's the quote from McAllister in the Book of Invasions. I think this is the third recension, maybe. So this little piece is talking about Bridget, the poetess, daughter of the Dagda. It's funny, it's quite like the opening of the entry in Cormac's glossary. Bridget, the poetess, daughter of the Dagda. It's she who had Fae and Men, the two royal oxen. Then it goes on to describe these oxen. And down in the middle of the third line, and it was Torc Triath with them, king of the boars of Ireland, of whom Mag Triarnian is named. So that would be the plain of this boar. With them were heard the three demon cries in Ireland after ravaging, whistling, wailing, and outcry. Okay. So that last bit is sometimes connected to Bridget's keening when Röden is killed. So in our story, the boar is indeed in Ireland and has been laying waste to Ireland when King Arthur takes his men to try and hunt it down, which is where we learned this. So this is from Culhwch and Olwen, and they're in Ireland trying to get this boar. So that day until the evening, the Irish fought with him, that's the boar, but still he laid waste to a fifth of Ireland. The next day, the host of Arthur fought with him, and they only got harm from him and nothing good. So Arthur's men can't do anything with him. And the third day, Arthur himself fought with him for 9 days and 9 nights. Well, this is one tough pig. And he did not kill any of the pigs. So the Torc Triath has offspring, piglets, with him. He did not kill any of the pigs apart from one pigling. Then the men asked Arthur, what was the origin of that swine? Now he said he was a king, and because of his sins, God turned him into a swine. So the boar is also thought of as a king here, even though his backstory is a bit different. But things get a bit more interesting as we continue with this scene. So Arthur has an interpreter called Gurhir. And in this story, he's able to understand the speech of animals, which comes in handy once or twice. So Arthur sent Gurhir to parley with him. That's the boar again. And Gurhir went in the form of a bird, landing over the lair of him and his 7 young pigs. And Gurhir asked him, for the sake of the one who made you into this shape, if you can speak, I ask one of you to come and speak with Arthur. Now Grigin Gurkeraint, like wings of silver were all his bristles. The path he could follow through the wood and the meadow could be seen by the glitter of his bristles. So this little piglet is very pretty and silvery in color. This was the answer which Grigin gave. By him who made us in this shape, we will not do or say anything for Arthur. It was grievous enough what God had done for us without you coming to fight with us. Now you might well wonder where I'm going with this. Well, in the metrical Denhenicus, poem 50, is the Denhenicus of Duma Shelga, from which this is a quote. And this is a tale of men turned into pigs. Okay, so this is just a few bits. The whole thing is quite convoluted and weird, and the language is difficult even in translation. So I honestly couldn't parse the whole story for you very well. But this is the description of what's happened. So the swine, under the protection of Drebru, daughter of Yachi Fevlik, who caused them to be brought to her? How did she come by the wild swine? Macindoc's own darling was Drebru, so she's a boyfriend or girlfriend of Angusog. She was given many a kiss, and the swine, when they were men, were likewise her own housemates. And then a bit further down, we're going to get a list of the pigs' names. And this is the beginning of it. From the day that their hue was darkened, after eating the fruit of the nut grove of Culhwch, this is a wood somewhere. I assume they were eating acorns. That's what wild boar do. These were the names of the faultless warriors. So they've been turned into pigs, and now they have new names, right? So Freichan, Banban, Brogarban, these are the first three names. Now we don't find the Tortriath here, but we find this chap Freichan. And the name means little heather. Yeah, Freich heather, and the on part is a diminutive. So guess what Griggen means? Remember the pig, the silvery pig was called Griggen? That's right, means little heather. I get chills over things like this because, and maybe I'm just excitable, but finding cognates and details like this in common between Irish and Welsh lore at this kind of granular level makes me really think about how they made their way from one culture to another. And while I love medieval texts, I also very much, I stand in awe of the bards on both sides of the Irish Sea who managed to preserve so much material over centuries, especially in Britain, where native culture was under all this tremendous pressure that I was talking about. So I don't think we can always answer the question of how these connections occur in the mythology. Is it a chance communication between two storytellers near the time when one of the texts was written down, for example? Or are these artifacts of a time when perhaps the culture and religion and language of Britain and Ireland had a greater similarity? You know, does it go back to that? Was there maybe a kind of insular Celtic language and a much more of a continuum of culture between the two islands? Or was this a result of the bards and druids, perhaps, being in greater communication in the past between the two islands? Caesar talks about how the druids in Gaul were trained in Britain. And it's possible that there was a lot more exchange between what druidic schools or bardic schools, that kind of thing between the various cultures. So there are a lot of maybes and what ifs in that, I realize, because we don't know. Yet I've always found the connections between the various Celtic cultures much more interesting and rewarding to explore than the differences. And I understand that not everybody identifies with such a melting pot of Celtic culture as we have in southern Scotland. But don't you get just a little tingle at connections like this? I know I do.